Hey, church, let's get right into the Word today. We're going to begin by listening to perhaps some familiar music to you. I want to see if you can guess if you recognize this music. Here we go. Listen to a few seconds of this. What is that? Mission Impossible, absolutely. Mission Impossible. It is a very popular movie series, so much so that movie number 6 is coming out this summer, July 2018. And if you are kind of like me, older in age, you and I would remember not just the movie, but the television series. It was out back in the 1970s, and whether it was Ethan Hunt or whether it was Jim Phelps, they heard about a mission that seemed to be impossible to accomplish. And so they heard this mission described to them in a most cryptic way. And at the end of that message to them, your mission, Jim, or your mission, Ethan, should you choose to what? To accept it. It was all about the acceptance of that mission, accepting a mission. And then once they accepted that mission, then they began to develop a mission strategy. They put all of the pieces together for accomplishing that mission. And as they did that, they assembled a team of highly skilled, talented, and courageous people who then would execute the mission. Once all of the pieces were in place, once they had pursued it, then they would push play and execute the mission. And at the end of every movie, at the end of every single television episode, it was always mission, what do you think? Accomplished. That's right, mission accomplished. Happened all the time. Now, you might be thinking, why on earth are we doing this? Well, I believe that Jesus had a mission. And we're going to look at the mission of Jesus through those 4 stages, those 4 pieces, just like that seemingly impossible mission for Ethan Hunt or Jim Phelps. As a matter of fact, if you and I just turn the hands back on the clock a little bit and we go to the year 2004, there was a movie that perhaps you saw. It was called The Passion of the Christ. Anybody remember that movie? It was incredible. It depicted, using cinematography, the horrific suffering of Jesus. Now, this is what I want to invite you to do with me. It says if you and I are going to now step behind the scenes, we're going to go backstage and see what was behind the physical suffering of Jesus. We are, in these weeks, we're attempting to see the fullness of the cost of the life of Christ, His life for ours, at the most deep, most profound place. So to do that, we're going to go backstage. We're going to go theologically behind the scenes and figure this out, because Jesus was a man on a mission. So much so, here we go on the journey. Luke chapter 19, verse 10. Jesus said, "The Son of Man came to seek and to save what was lost." He was a man on a mission. Similarly, over in Mark chapter 10, verse 45, Jesus said the Son of Man came to serve and not be served, and to give His life as a ransom for many. In both of those instances, it was all about His number one mission. He was master physician, He was master teacher, but those were not His principal missions. His number one, most important mission was to seek and to save the lost by giving His life as a ransom for many. Now, we're going to go a little bit deeper here on this mission that He had been given. In 1 Peter chapter 1, we read of a most incredible statement. Now watch for it. "For you know that it was not with perishable things such as silver or gold that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from your ancestors, but with the precious blood of Christ." A what? A lamb. Notice Jesus is being called a lamb without blemish or defect. "He was chosen before the creation of the world, but was revealed in these last times for your sake." What I want us to call attention to is this phrase: He was chosen before the creation of the world. Before God said, "Let there be light," before Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 took place, before God said, "In the beginning," and He pushed start on the chronometer of measured time, Before the creation of the world, Jesus said yes to this mission. Your mission, Jesus, should you choose to accept it, is to go and be a ransom for many, is to go and redeem all of humanity from eternity in hell. Your mission, Jesus, should you choose to accept it, was offered to him before God said, "Let there be light." And that's huge. Before the earth even existed, Jesus said yes, and it was mission accepted. Mission accepted. That's huge. Now, there's something more. Let's go down a deeper level still. We're going deeper and deeper, behind stage, backstage. We want to understand something else about this mission. He said to his guys, "Go into the city to a certain man and tell him, the teacher," that would be Jesus, the rabbi, the teacher says, "My appointed time is near. I'm going to celebrate the Passover with my disciples." Now, Jesus was going to die during the Passover. This passage, Matthew 26, he's in Jerusalem. It is the feast of Passover. Jesus had to die during Passover, not during Pentecost, not during any other religious holiday. It had to be Passover. Passover was a week long, and there was a day during Passover when all of the lambs had to be sacrificed. There was a day, it was called the Day of Unleavened Bread, when all of those tens of thousands of lambs that these hundreds of thousands of people have come to Jerusalem for Passover, they were going to kill the lambs. So this phrase, "my appointed time," is huge. It's very important. It was appointed to Jesus. It was a date with death assigned to him by who do you think? God. That's right, God his Father had appointed the day on which Jesus would die. He had a date with death on a certain day. Now, let's go on. One more observation here, and then we're going to make a discovery. It says over in the Gospel of John, "Now is the time for judgment on this world." That stands out. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. Now is time for judgment on this world. Now, the prince of this world will be driven out, and when I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all people to myself. Jesus said this to show the kind of death he was going to die. This statement was describing how he would die, and it's right here in this phrase, lifted up. He would be lifted up on a what? Anybody? On a cross. This is very similar to John chapter 3. We know 3:16 of John, but in 3:14 of John, Jesus said, "As Moses lifted the serpent on the stake, so the Son of Man must be lifted up." He prophesied how he would die, and he prophesied, "I will die on a cross being lifted up." So here's our discovery about his mission. Jesus, he had to die on a certain day and in a certain way. He had to die during Passover on the day of unleavened bread in Jerusalem, dying on a certain day and in a certain way on a cross. If Jesus had died on any other day or in any other way, he would not have accomplished his what? His mission. It would have been a mission aborted, a mission failed, and if he had failed at fulfilling his mission, there would be no church, there would be no Christianity, there would be no Christian schools or Christian hospitals, and the only destiny for every person ever to live would be to burn for eternity in hell. Period. End of discussion. So you and I've got to understand the enormity of his mission. It was seemingly impossible. But yet Jesus accepted the mission accepted. And when did he accept it? Before creation. Before God said, "Let there be light." He accepted that mission. Incredible. All right, now, let's go to that next piece of Mission Impossible. Once they accepted the mission, it was all about the strategy. Had to develop a strategy. Jesus had to be in Jerusalem on a certain day so he could die in a certain way. He's going to protect his mission. And it says over and again in the scriptures that Jesus, he was on his way to Jerusalem, and he made some very specific decisions, 4 to be very exact. Let me share with you his 4-part strategy. In John chapter 7, it says in verse 1, "After this, Jesus went around in Galilee. He did not go to Judea because the Jewish leaders were looking for a way to kill him. He couldn't die by a stabbing. He couldn't die by being thrown off the hill at Nazareth. He couldn't die by stoning. He had to die how? By being lifted up on a what? On a cross. So what did Jesus do? He avoided danger. There's his first strategy. He did not go into places among people that would pose a threat to him being killed prematurely. He avoided danger. Strategy number one. Number two, it says over in the Gospel of Mark that Jesus did not say anything to them, meaning the Jewish leaders, without saying a parable. This was one of his favorite ways of communicating, of teaching. And many times the Jewish leaders, they would listen to a parable and they go, say what? Is he talking about us again? Is that about us? And sure enough, it was, but they couldn't quite figure it out. He didn't want to say directly what he had to say to them because he would inflame their hate for him all the more early, prematurely, and he had to die where? On a cross, in a certain way, on a certain day. As a matter of fact, Jesus never once called himself the Son of God. Never once. He called himself over and again Son of Man, Son of Man. Because if he had said Son of God, what would the Jews have yelled? They would have yelled, blasphemy. That's right, blasphemy. And blasphemy could be punishable by stoning, death by stoning. Could he die by stoning? Absolutely not. Death only by crucifixion. He prophesied the way that he had to die. And if Jesus didn't die on a certain day in a certain way, he'd be a false prophet. If he were a false prophet, he could not be the sinless, spotless Lamb of God dying for our sin. This is huge. All right, now, Jesus then, secondly, spoke carefully. There's the second strategy of Jesus. He spoke ever so carefully. There would come a time, the last week of his life, when he would speak bluntly and boldly, directly to the Jewish leaders, calling them out. Strategy 3, Matthew chapter 21. They looked for a way to arrest him. This is in Jerusalem, the final week of his life. They, the Jewish leaders, looked for a way to arrest him. But they were afraid of the crowd because the people held that he was a prophet. Even there in Jerusalem during Passover with hundreds of thousands of people, shoulder to shoulder there in that city, Jesus, as he's moving about them, he moved among people who loved him. And they were like a security detail around him. Jesus surrounded himself with people, number 3. Because those people, they would be like a secret service detail. They're not going to allow any assassin get to Jesus during that last week of his life. And finally, number 4, his fourth strategy, Jesus expertly managed the last week of his life. Let me just give you a few examples of that because he enters into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, what you and I call Palm Sunday, and all week long, he's expertly managing the last week of his life. All week long, he's like the director behind a camera calling all of the shots, the cues for the movie. So as we go backstage theologically of his death, Jesus expertly managed the last week of his life. Here are a few examples. In Mark chapter 11, he enters Jerusalem for the triumphal entry. He's parading through the streets, and then finally in verse 11, he arrives in the temple courts. But then notice, he looked around at everything, but since it was already late in the day that means, the sun is beginning to set. It's late in the day. He went out to Bethany with the 12, with his disciples, out to Bethany. And Bethany was just outside of the city walls of Jerusalem, a very short walk. He goes to Bethany. And then notice the next day. So that would tell us that Jesus spent the night where? In Bethany. He stayed overnight in Bethany. Now, who lived in Bethany? What was his name? Raised him from the dead. What was his name? Lazarus lived in Bethany. Lazarus loved Jesus, as did Mary and Martha, the sisters of Lazarus. They were very tight, very close. We do not know for certain where they stayed. I'm going to speculate that probably they stayed with Lazarus. And then notice the next day, as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. So much so, do you remember the story? He goes over to a tree and he finds no fruit on it. What kind of a tree was it? Anyone remember? A fig tree. And what did he do to that tree? He cursed that tree, that's right. And then he goes into town, into Jerusalem. He goes to the temple court, and he turns the money table, changing tables over. He gets in the face of the Jews, and they just despise him all the more. They want him dead. And then that day comes to an end. And watch this. When evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. They leave Jerusalem. The sun's beginning to set. In the morning, so that means they spent the night. Wherever they are, they spent the night. In the morning, as they went along, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots. Where did they go that night? Back to Bethany. That's right, back to Bethany. So therein lies a pattern. Jesus, he goes into Jerusalem during the day. He goes to the temple. He says what needs to be said. He does what needs to be done. And the Jews hate him all the more. They despise him. They want him dead. But as the sun begins to set and it's growing dark, he goes out of the city. He goes to Bethany, to a safe place where he is loved, so he can sleep safely during the night, because bad things happen when? In the dark. Bad things happen in the dark. And the city is full of hundreds of thousands of Jews, and the Jewish power people, the brokers, power brokers, want him dead. So they're going to go to anybody and everybody and say, hey, if you see him, let us know. We'll make it worth your while. Let us know. They gave one guy 30 pieces of silver, and we know what happened to him. If you see him, you let us know. Let us know. So Jesus is expertly managing the last week of his life. He's going through this pattern all week long, and then come Thursday, Luke chapter 22, watch this. Then came the day of unleavened bread, Thursday, on which the Passover Lamb had to be sacrificed. Stop right there. Passover Lamb had to be sacrificed. Go all the way back to Exodus chapter 12, the very first moment when lambs were sacrificed as God's angel passed over Egypt. This was when God rescued his people out of Egypt who were slaves. He said, you take a lamb, you kill the lamb, you take the blood of that lamb, and you put it on the door frames of your homes, and then you go in, you roast that lamb, you eat that lamb with bitter herbs and unleavened bread, and you stay in your house. You stay in your house, because my angel is going to pass over Egypt and kill every firstborn male. Every firstborn son of Egypt will be killed. You stay in that house of yours, underneath the blood of that lamb, and you'll live. So for centuries, the Jews observed Passover. And what did they do on the day of unleavened bread during that week? They killed the Passover lamb. When did they do that? Exodus 12, verse 6, at twilight. When's twilight? When the sun begins to set, go down. So about 6 o'clock in the evening, they're killing all of these lambs. 100,000 people, hundreds of thousands of people in Jerusalem for this. They bring tens of thousands of lambs to the priest to sacrifice in about 60 minutes, maybe 90 at the most. So it's all hands on deck. Not a single priest had PTO. Everybody had to work. Nobody could call in sick. So they're straddling the lambs, and they pick up the chin, they slit the throat, they gather the blood in a cup or a vessel, they pour it out at the base of the altar. Thousands, tens of thousands of these. They hand that carcass back to us. And what did we do with it? We took it home there in Jerusalem. We skinned it, we gutted it, and we cooked it. We didn't nuke it, we didn't boil it, we didn't flash pan fry it. We roasted it. And when did all of that happen? It happened about 6 p.m., maybe 7 at the latest. So about what time that night are we going to eat? It's going to be late. It's going to be close to midnight. That's right. We're going to be bumping midnight. So this meal that Jesus is going to have with his guys is going to be very late at night. And he says to his guys, Peter and John, go and make preparations for us to eat the Passover. That's going to be in Jerusalem. And they're going to be eating 11, 12 o'clock at night. And 11, 12 o'clock at night, it is very dark. And what happens in the dark? Bad things. Jesus could be killed when he's in town eating that meal. But watch this. Where do you want us to prepare for it? They asked. And he replied, as you enter the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him to the house that he enters and say to the owner of the house, the teacher asks, where's the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? He'll show you a large room upstairs, all furnished. Make preparations there. Well, that's all fine and good. Peter and John, they go into the city and they see hundreds of thousands of guys, and they all look alike. They got long hair. And they got long beards, and they got curls by the side of their head, and they're all wearing the same color of clothing, dirty. All right, they all look the same. How are they going to find this guy? He's going to stick out like a sore thumb because he's got a what? A jar of water. Who carried water in that day? Women did. Not being chauvinistic here, it's just a cultural observation. Jesus met a woman at the well in John chapter 4. So here's this guy. He's going to stick out like a sore thumb from all of those tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of other guys. And they're going to go, he's the guy. And they're going to go up, hey, the teacher says you're going to take us someplace to make preparations for the Passover. Oh, yeah, come with me. We're going to go over to 787 Juniper Street. That's where we're going. So they go over to the house. They knock on the door. And the owner of the house opens the door. And the guy with the water jar takes it off from his head. And he goes, boy, I'm glad I can get that off my head now. And he goes away. And they go into that room to make that preparation. And that tells us that that location had to be a secret. Jesus had to eat Passover in Jerusalem, and it's going to be very dark at the time of night when he's going to eat. And there were people looking to take his life. Can't die by an assassin's blade. He's got to die how? On a cross, on a certain day, in a certain way. And if he aborted his mission, you and I would not even be here in this moment, because there would be no church. That is this significant. Then the meal was being served, John chapter 13. The evening meal was in progress. In other words, the food was there. They were eating the meal. It was in progress. The food was being served. So he got up from the meal, and he took off his outer clothing, and he wrapped a towel around his waist. What did he do? He poured water into a basin, and he began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Now, why did he do that? If you go over to verse 15, it says that he speaks, and he says, I have done this to give to you an example, to show you an example that you should do the same for one another, to wash each other's feet, to serve one another. But there's also another layer to this. Why did he do this? When did people have their feet washed when they entered a home? As soon as they walked in. That's right. As soon as they walked in, somebody would have their feet washed, and that somebody doing the washing of the feet would be a lowly servant. This would tell us that when they walked into that upper room that evening for the Passover meal, there were no servants there to wash feet. They had been given the night off. Why? Because no one could know where Jesus was on that night. A lowly servant could easily be bribed, could easily betray the location of Jesus. They had been dismissed, and Jesus, again, remains in an upper room. He's an expert at dealing with all of the elements of the last week of his life. He's managing it expertly. Now, at the dinner table, there's a conversation that takes place. And he says, my heart is troubled. One of you will, what, anybody? Betray me. And immediately they began to ask one another, is it I? Is it I? Is it I? Who is it, Lord? Who is it? Who is it? And Jesus, he says, it is the one to whom I will give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish. And then dipping it in the dish, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. As soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out, and it was night. So what's happening here is occurring in just seconds. It's the one to whom I give this piece of bread when dipping it in the dish. So Jesus does that. He hands it to Judas, and it says in the text, he says to Judas, go and do what you have to do and do it quickly. And he slips out. He's got to get out of that upper room because he has to betray Jesus, his location, to the authorities, both Roman and Jewish. He's got to get out. Now, if Jesus had said, it's Judas, that man right there, what would have happened? They would have been on that boy. Absolutely. He would have never gotten out of that upper room. But Jesus, expertly managing the last week of his life, has got to get him out of that room. They then go to Gethsemane. And Judas knew where to take them because in John chapter 18, verse 2, it says that Jesus had often met with his disciples there. Judas knew exactly where to take them. And notice that while they were there, a fight breaks out. And Jesus, he turns to Simon Peter, who had the sword. He drew it. He struck the high priest servant, cutting off his right ear. The guy's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given to me? Notice that phrase, the cup. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? So Jesus immediately takes control of what could have grown into a riot where he could have been prematurely killed. And once he's got control of the crowd, he turns himself over and is taken into custody. And in a matter of hours, Mark chapter 15, they crucified him. So you see, Jesus expertly managed the last week of his life. This was mission executed now. He's now on the cross. All of that strategy led him to the moment when he had to push play and get on that cross. He's got to die on a certain day and in a certain way. This seemingly impossible mission. So Jesus, he's now on the cross, and I believe that his 6 hours on the cross, they are indeed equivalent to all of humanity going to hell for all of eternity, and here's why. His suffering on the cross looks like this. And all of you musicians in the room, what is this? Anyone? That's a crescendo mark, exactly. And what does crescendo mean? Anyone? To get louder. The volume increases. I believe that the volume, the intensity of the suffering of Jesus increased. We know that it was obviously physical in every sense. He suffered physically. Jesus was horrifically tortured. Jesus was impaled on a cross. He had the crown of thorns pushed on his head. He had all manner of wounds on his body. He suffered physically, and that's oftentimes where we stop thinking. But I'm here to tell you, his suffering was much louder than that. I believe that he suffered emotionally. Think with me for a moment. Jesus is on the cross. He is there naked. One of the greatest fears of the Jew, to be naked in front of others. That goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve were naked and God goes looking for them and they were hiding. Why? Because they were naked. They even said to God, "We were naked, so we hid ourselves." Who told you, God asked, you were naked? That fear goes all the way back to then. So Jesus is hanging on that cross naked. Why would we know that? The soldiers gambled for his clothing. They cast lots. And one of the texts says, for his seamless undergarment. They're not going to leave his seamless undergarment on him. It's going to be right there on the ground. They're going to take all of his clothing home after they punch out after a day's work. He's on that cross naked, and besides that, it says in Deuteronomy, cursed is anyone who is hung on a tree. So Jews are going by Jesus, and they are reviling him, mocking him, spitting at him. You're naked. You are nailed to a cross. You are under God's curse. And who's on that cross? Not only Son of Man, but Son of God. God the Creator is on that cross. Colossians chapter 1, verse 16. Speaking of Jesus, everything was made by him and for him. Jesus, the Creator, is on the cross, and the Creator is allowing the creature to whom he gave the breath of life to treat him this way. It had to have broken his what? His heart. He was suffering emotionally. And many times we don't even go there in considering his suffering. We've got to go backstage often and look theologically at the fullness of his suffering. And I believe the greatest suffering of all was spiritually. Jesus suffered horrifically in a spiritual way. How do we know that? From his conversation on the cross. He spoke 7 times from the cross. The first thing he said was, "Father, forgive them. They do not know what they're doing." As they were nailing the nails, hammering them in, pounding them into his hands and his feet, "Father, forgive them. They do not know what they're doing." And now notice this little detail, Father. And then he may have said, "Woman, behold your son. Son, behold your mother." Speaking to his mom, speaking to his disciple John. He might have then said, "Today you will be with me in paradise," to the thief next to him. And then he may have cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And notice the difference here, Father and God. Something happens in their relationship. And this is what makes 6 hours on the cross equivalent to all of humanity being in hell for all of eternity. Something happened in the relationship between Jesus and his Father. See, the Father has never treated the Son in this manner before. In this moment, my God, Jesus wants the attention of his Father. Think with me for a moment. In the Old Testament, when Abraham was about to sacrifice Isaac, his son, he's got that sharp knife raised above his head, and this voice shouts at him, "Abraham, Abraham, do not lay a hand on that boy." Remember that? When Moses was at a burning bush, Remember that one? Moses, Moses, take off your shoes, your sandals, for the ground where you're standing is holy. When Saul was on the road to Damascus in the book of Acts, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? When somebody shouted a name twice, they wanted somebody's what? Attention. Jesus on the cross wanted God's attention. Something happened in their relationship in that moment. Isaiah chapter 53, verse 6, and God laid on him the sins, the iniquities of us all. It was in that moment that God laid on Jesus all of our sins. And then Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 13, it says, God's eyes are too pure to even look on evil. God turns his back on his son, and he pours out all of his rage, all of his fury, all of his wrath on his son, because the wages of sin is death. And who should have received that wrath? Us. All of us. The night before, he's in Gethsemane. He's praying. The same prayer 3 times we read in the text. If it's repeated, it's important. There's something in that prayer that God wants us to see. It's there 3 times. And Jesus prays, Father, if it be possible, may this cup pass from me. May this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. 3 times. Now, he wasn't asking to be spared the cross, because when did he accept that mission? Even before God said, let there be light. Before creation, Jesus said, I'm in, I'll go, I'll die. He accepted his mission. What's he now asking about this cup? May this cup pass from me. If you look up Isaiah 51, verse 17, and many other verses like it, it refers to the cup of God's wrath. The cup of God's wrath. What he did not want to experience was the wrath of God, because the Father had never treated his Son in that manner before. At the baptism of Jesus, he's coming up out of the Jordan River. A voice from heaven was heard saying, you are my beloved Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased. The Father loved the Son. The wrath of God was never before experienced in this moment in the life of Jesus. So all of the fury, rage, wrath of God is poured out on him. And then Jesus, he says, I thirst. They moisten his tongue. He's going to make a very important statement right here, and we'll speak of that in just a moment. And then he says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And he breathed his last. See, something happened during those 6 hours to the relationship. Father, God. And it's when God poured out all of his wrath, because God had placed all of our sin on his Son. Mission is accomplished here because Jesus cried out from the cross right before he dies, it is what? It is finished. And he's not referring to his life physically. Oh, my life's over. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about the payment of your sin debt and mine. This word finished, this phrase is a single word in Greek, and in it is this meaning of payment. In the Old Testament, when animals were sacrificed for sin and their blood was spilled, all that happened, the blood of animals, they kept just rolling that sin debt forward. But then along came Jesus Christ, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world. When his blood, his life was poured out on the cross, he said, it is finished, paid in full, once and for all, not paid by renewal, no, paid in full, sin debt gone. You talk about mission accomplished, that's exactly it. Paid in full, mission accomplished by the person of Jesus Christ. Incredible. Incredible. Yes, shall we? Let's give praise to God. Praise be to Jesus. We need to think about this. Jesus said, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the church. All right, now for us. What does this mean for us? 2 groups of people. Those of us who are followers of Jesus, we need to think about our mission. Our mission looks like this. This happened in the news. Maybe you saw this a few years ago. Took place out in Utah when Brandon Wright, age 21, a student at Utah State University, riding his motorcycle, collided with a sedan. Brandon is pinned underneath that car. The motorcycle is in flames, and very quickly, what could happen? The car could likewise erupt in flames. These people who are coming are taking their very own lives at risk. And they notice that he is still alive, unconscious but alive. A few people couldn't lift the car, but a group of people did. And then notice this guy in the green shirt. He reaches down and he pulls Brandon out from underneath that car, unconscious but very much alive, suffering many internal injuries. And then, of course, 911, they arrive, they take him to the hospital. He has multiple surgeries. He's released from the hospital. I still remember the evening news when he was interviewed, when he was dismissed from the hospital. He's sitting there in a wheelchair, and he's sobbing, and he could barely talk. He was thanking the people who literally risked their lives to save him from the flames, And when I saw that story, I thought, that's our mission, should we choose to accept it. Because in Jude, verse 23, it says, we are to snatch people from the flames. Not the flames of an automobile accident. We are to snatch people from the flames of hell. That's our mission, our number one mission. Just as Jesus had secondary missions and a number one mission, so it also is the same for us. Our number one mission is to bring people to Christ. To Christ. You see, it's not that a church has a mission, but that Jesus' mission has a church. We want the church that you and I are a part of, to have this as our mission, to seek and to save those who are lost, to go and make disciples of all nations. Penn Jillette is a very famous magician, but he's also very well known as an atheist. A person went and gave to him a New Testament, told him about Jesus and whatnot, and Penn Jillette was very polite and accommodating that man's conversation with him. And later, Penn Jillette said this. He said, how much do you have to hate somebody to believe everlasting life is possible and not tell them that? This is from an atheist. What a powerful question for all of us. How much do you and I have to hate somebody who we say that we love to believe that everlasting life is possible and not tell them about everlasting life? See, you and I cannot say that we love someone and then not share with them the truth about eternity. Whether it's mom and dad, grandma, grandpa, grandson, granddaughter, son, daughter, aunt, uncle, brother, sister, next door neighbor, friend at school. You and I cannot say that we love them and yet not tell them about the reality that they will die in hell without Jesus if they do not come to Christ. And we can do that speaking truth in love. Speaking truth in love. This has got to be a part of the conversation. Has to be. So as a church, we're sent. As the Father has sent me, Jesus said, so I'm sending you. And you and I, we don't have to be afraid of the Great Commission. Go make disciples of all nations. Because the Great Commission comes with a great companion. And I will be with you always, even to the end of the age. Our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to bring people to Christ. Who's the last person you brought to Christ? Who's the last person you immersed into the faith? Who's the last person that you and I prayed for, prayed over, invested a friendship in that individual's life, poured ourselves into that friendship for the sheer privilege of sharing with them the good news of Jesus? If you and I cannot remember the name of a person, something's broken in our walk with Jesus. That's our mission. Now, if you are here and you are not yet a follower of Jesus, here's what I believe this walk backstage reveals. Jesus said to Martha, the sister of Lazarus, he said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. And he turns to Martha and he asks her, do you believe this? And she said, yes. My friend, do you believe? Do you believe that Jesus is the resurrection and the life? If so, then please take that next step. Surrender your life to Christ. Be immersed, baptized into Christ. We're going to open the doors to the porch. And I invite you, I plead with you, I beg of you, please act on your belief in Jesus and surrender your life to Christ. This last week, you and I heard in the news, we read in the paper of many people once again dying and not expecting to die. They were in accidents, they were shot, they were a victim of a gun violent moment. We heard that in the news again, week after week, time and time again. You and I cannot predict the day on which we're going to die, but we can certainly prepare for that day, because the best way to be most assured about tomorrow is to be right with God today through His Son, Jesus Christ. And we want to introduce you to Him. We want so much to share Him with you. So please, today is the day of life, of salvation. Our Jesus accomplished His mission, and because He accomplished His mission, He's coming again, and we will be victorious. Praise be to Almighty God.